If you know anything about me, you know that I love Niccolo Machiavelli. I view him as one of the most wrongly reviled thinkers of the modern era. Today, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Alexander Lee, the author of what I consider to be the foremost biography of Machiavelli. We will discuss what made this figure so unique, his childhood and greatest influences, and will return to my ultimate question: does Machiavelli deserve to be called Machiavellian? I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. I hope that each of you are having a great week. Just a reminder to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can stay notified every time I post a Julie Noted news video or a Timeless episode. And also be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Julie R. Hartman. As I said in the introduction, I am happy to welcome Dr. Alexander Lee to the program. He is a professor of Renaissance Studies at the University of Warwick. He holds a degree from both the University of Cambridge and of Edinburgh. Dr. Lee is also the author of numerous academic works on the Renaissance, including Petrarch and St. Augustine, Classical Scholarship and Christian Theology, as well as the origins of the Renaissance in Italy. He also writes frequent columns for History Today on a variety of historical subjects. I went over some of these columns this morning and I found them to be really fun and a bit eccentric in their subject matter. But today we're going to be discussing his book, Machiavelli, His Life and Times. Hi, Dr. Lee. Welcome to Timeless.
Hi, thanks very much for having me on.
So as I told you before the show, and as many of my viewers know, I recently did an episode called Machiavelli Myths. And I talked about what I called in the introduction my ultimate question. Does Machiavelli deserve to be called Machiavellian? Machiavellian today refers to someone who is ruthless, someone without virtue, and shocker, I don't think that Machiavelli is deserving of that. But I was focusing a lot in that episode, on his book, The Prince, and it impelled me to want to learn more about his childhood and his upbringing, which brought me to your book. Can you please give us a synopsis of Machiavelli's early life and some of his influences, both good and bad?
Sure. Well, Machiavelli's early life is perhaps not what you'd expect from someone with his name, and especially given the associations of his name. He's born into a relatively comfortable family that is proud of its aristocratic origins, but which has slightly declined since its heyday. His father, Bernardo, is trained, is a legally trained man, but never really practices his profession for a variety of reasons, one of which is that he's a public debtor. He's late in paying his taxes, which bars him from a certain number of public functions and political responsibilities in Florence. But nevertheless, Machiavelli has a very good education, or typically good education of his time. It's not exceptional, it's not terrible, it's a typical education of his time. His father is well connected with many of the leading minds of his day, despite his financial woes. And the family is also slightly on the outside of the political spectrum of all the political elite, due principally to a political intrigue that one of his more distant relations was involved in the mid-15th century. Machiavelli's schooling is something we know not a huge amount about. We know that his father was quite an avid collector, or quite an avid purchaser and borrower of books. We also know that his father was sufficiently learned to be asked to prepare a topographical index to Livy's History of Rome. One of the things we do know about Machiavelli's childhood is that he may well have been sexually abused as a young boy or a young man. There is some slight uncertainty about this. It's not definitively proved, but there is a strong likelihood, given a comment that's made in a later letter, and given that the teacher in question is subsequently found guilty after a fashion of a similar crime with others. Anyway, Machiavelli finishes the normal course of education. We don't know if he goes on to a university, the Florentine studio. It's quite possible, it's quite probable. If there, he would certainly have followed the usual kind of courses in Latin literature from some of the leading people of the day. When he's reaching maturity, it's an interesting situation, really, for two reasons. One, because he is living in Florence at a time, or he's born in Florence at a time when the Medici family are at their height. Although Florence is technically a republic, it's been dominated since 1434 by one family, the Medici, who use a series of formal and informal connections to manipulate, or at least dominate, the organs of republican governance. And Machiavelli, as I said, the family is sort of on the fringes of the political major political circles, and he is quite keen as a young man to join the circle around the younger Medici, or the younger members, the leading members of the Medici family. And he writes, some of his earliest works are little poems that he writes to one of the younger members of the Medici family that are affectionate, playful, funny, self-deprecating, and in a way slightly homoerotic. Unfortunately, he shows what is going to be a trait that will stay with him for the rest of his life, and that's bad timing. He's trying to get in with the Medici at exactly the wrong time, because in 1494, the head of the Medici family, Piero de' Medici, is forced out of the city, and the whole family goes into exile. So Machiavelli's out in the wilderness, and in their stead, a Dominican friar called Girolamo Savonarola rises to prominence and again dominates in an unofficial fashion the politics of the city for the next 4 years. And Machiavelli, during that period, continues his reading, continues his studies. He writes, transcribes and writes some notes on Lucretius's De Rem Natura, which many believe had an important influence on his later thinking. But in a sense, this fact of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, being slightly out of the swim, does actually eventually stand him in good stead. Because when Savonarola eventually falls and is burnt to death at the stake in 1498, Machiavelli is the perfect person to fill an important bureaucratic role in the Republic. He's good, but not so dazzling as to be off-putting. He knows many of the right people, but not close enough to have been politically tarnished by association. So on his second try, he's elected second Chancellor of the Florentine Republic. And that marks the beginning of his entry into public affairs.
It's interesting that you say that Machiavelli had bad timing, because he speaks or writes a lot in The Prince about the balance of fortune and circumstance, or virtue. And so, and he says, if I'm remembering correctly, that 50% in life can be attributed to the role fortune or lack of fortune plays, and then the other half is attributed to essentially what you make of yourself. So it seems now more understandable how he came to that conclusion, given that fortune played with him sometimes in his life.
Well, that's a very interesting point you raise. Machiavelli is quite clear throughout his later writings that fortune he characterizes fortune as a fickle and capricious woman who, with apologies to many of your listeners and viewers, he thinks that fortune can change on a whim, really, and throw human affairs into confusion with no kind of warning. And it is important if you want to get on in life, particularly if you want to be a political leader, to know how to adapt to fortune, how to make the best of changing circumstances, how not to be knocked off your feet when fortune deals you a blow, and know how to take advantage of fortune when she swings your way. Now, Machiavelli admires political figures who can do this. One of the people he admires, one of the earliest people he admires in this regard, is Julius II, the warrior pope who asked Michelangelo to paint him with a sword in his hand rather than a book. But in his own life, as you rightly point out, Machiavelli is actually quite bad at this. In fact, not just early on in his life, but right to the very, very end of his life, he is very frequently caught on the hop. He's caught out by fortune. A good example at the very, very end of his life. He spent many, many years after serving the Florentine Republic and being kicked out of a job when the Medici returned, trying to get back in with the Medici again, and he eventually succeeds in winning their confidence in a series of reasonably mid-grade responsibilities, only for them to fall again. And so he's caught out. He still has some hopes because the people who have ousted the Medici are old friends of his. But at that point, they think, well, he's just too tainted. He's too old, he's too tainted, and that's it. Before he has a chance to catch up again, he's dead. So quite often, for someone who admired and valued those who could take advantage of fortune, he was actually not very good at it himself sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes the way to learn the importance of something is if you do it poorly and realize that you needed to do it better. So forgive me, but for a moment, I just want to outline this history. I want to make sure that I got it right because it is a bit confusing. So he grew up during the Medici family's rule, and then he became a diplomat in Florence during the Medici family's exile during...
No.
Well, good. I'm glad I clarified. I'm glad I clarified.
I'm so sorry. No, I'm so sorry.
Please correct me.
Forgive me. I jumped in before the crucial word exile. Forgive me. Please.
Oh, so
please
I was right. Oh, who knew? No.
You were very definitely right. I was presumptuous. So.
No, that's fine. So he was a diplomat during the Medici family's exile, when there was an experiment with a Florentine republic, and then that republic, after about a decade, was overthrown, and the Medici family came back, and then Machiavelli was the one who was exiled. Is that correct?
Yes. When the Medici return in 1512, Machiavelli has been in his job, if you like, as a senior bureaucrat and occasional diplomat for the Florentine Republic for about 13 years. He is, after a short period of uncertainty, booted out of his job, unlike his boss, who keeps his job. And then Machiavelli makes a rather fatal mistake in that he starts bad-mouthing the Medici. A short time afterwards, a plot against the Medici is discovered. It's called the Bosco di Caponi plot. And when the ringleaders are taken into custody, one of them happens to name Machiavelli as a figure who's been associated with this plot. Now, this may or may not be true. Most likely, his name was included on the list simply as someone who might possibly be approached. But the Medici won't take any chances at this stage. It was important. They were very, very uncertain in these early days after returning to the city, even though Machiavelli most likely knew some of their leading figures quite well from his youth. They arrested him, threw him in prison, and tortured him using a method called strappado, where you have your hands tied behind your back and the rope attached to your wrists, and then you're lifted up by I'm not going to try and do it because it's very painful, lifted up by the rope until it's too painful. Essentially, it dislocates your shoulders and causes a great deal of pain. He's left there for a little while, and interestingly, he writes a couple of poems to his old friend Giuliano de' Medici from prison. And these are interesting because they give you a real insight of the character of the man. One would imagine that if you were in prison and being tortured by someone you'd known in your youth, you would probably, be a bit pitiful, maybe try and say I'm bearing things heroically, but come on, the usual kind of tropes that we'd resort to. But in actual fact, Machiavelli tries self-deprecating humor instead. And he said, I can't stand this. I'm not a strong person. I'm a coward. I'm not built for this. Please let me out. And he plays on these wonderful kind of chivalric norms to provoke humor at his own expense. And he is let out when one of the Medici is elected pope and there's a general amnesty, but he's left out in the wilderness and he has to go off to after a short while of kind of cooling his heels in Florence, he goes off to his farm in Vercosina, where he really does become he calls himself a gaglioffo, a good for nothing, hanging about in the local tavern and drinking and playing dice and wandering in the fields until at night he goes back home and puts on the gowns of court and palace and starts writing what will eventually become the prince.
He was a manipulator, that's for sure. And
do you mean personally?
I mean, I think he knew how to act in certain situations and did so. I mean, it's what you just said about using humor as a way to kind of get out of prison. I don't even necessarily, perhaps there's a bad connotation with the word, I mean, there is a bad connotation with the word manipulator, but he was strategic.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point. However, I think I'd quite like to introduce a distinction between Machiavelli as a private individual and Machiavelli as a public figure.
That's a good point.
As a private figure, he was immensely compelling. He is someone one can imagine socializing with very easily. Very charming, very urbane, very witty, incredibly intelligent, always fond of a drink and a laugh, ready with a joke, very fond of partying with his friends. Some of the most vivid letters, and he leaves a lot of letters behind. Some of the most vivid letters he writes and receives are to and from friends who are, and these letters talk about the vividness of his personal relations. It's very clear that he is one of the sort of leading lights of his social group, and yes, he can get his own way. His poor wife, for example, always seems to forgive him, even though he's a terrible womanizer. He has no end of affairs. So he can get his own way in person. As a public figure, however, I think the picture is rather more mixed. Later in life, he writes a briefing document, a short briefing document on how to be a diplomat for an acquaintance of his. And as part of this, he says you need to know how to recognize who's who in the court, know how to talk to them, how to approach them, how to get the most out of them in service of your state's interests. Did he do this in practice? Well, eventually, yes. Towards the end of his diplomatic careers, he was never an ambassador. He was only an ambassador once, I think. He was given ambassadorial powers once, a very minor mission. But for the rest of his diplomatic activities, he was only an emissary, which meant he couldn't conduct negotiations on his own behalf, on his own authority, rather. At the very end of his career, towards the end of his career, he's quite an adept diplomat. He is able to observe what's going on. He senses what's happening. He can suggest ways of getting the best of Florence. And in fact, on one occasion, he is sent on a mission essentially to hold the hands of a friend of his who's got the job that really should have been his. And he does it quite effectively, given the constraints acting on them. But at the very beginning of his career, he isn't that good at manipulating the situation around him. In fact, he's quite bad at it. One of his earliest missions is to a lady called Caterina Sforza, better known as the Tigress of Forli. And she is in a very difficult situation, the details of which need not concern us here. And in their meetings, she keeps dropping these very subtle hints as to what she really means. And poor Machiavelli just doesn't get it. So she has to send one of her secretaries round later that night to spell it out for him in words of one syllable. And so later on, when he goes on an early mission to France, he starts trying to tell the it's difficult to find the right word, but essentially the French chief minister, Cardinal Georges d'Amboise, how things are in Italy. And the cardinal gets a bit miffed and says, look, I think the king and I know pretty well how things are in Italy, thank you, young man, and rides off. So Machiavelli is quite often getting things a bit wrong. But if you want an illustration of the best illustration of when he gets things right and an indication of just how sensitive he can be in very trying situations, it would be a great idea to take a look at some of the diplomatic dispatches he writes when Cesare Borgia is about to fall from power. Now, many of your listeners and viewers, I'm sure, are very familiar with Cesare Borgia, one of the most compelling and darkest figures of his day. And Machiavelli writes a great deal about his demise. And you get it's one of the most compelling, psychologically profound portraits I think I know of, certainly from the early 16th century. And it testifies to all those skills that we've talked about.
Before we continue, I want to tell you about MyPillow. I walk into work every day wearing my slippers, and then I go home and sleep on my pillow. So to put it lightly, I use and enjoy their products. And you can enjoy them too at a deep discount to boot. If you use the promo code Hartman, Hartman, that's my last name, you can get a queen-sized MyPillow for $19.98. A regular price for a queen size is $69.98, and a king-size MyPillow is $10 more. So you can see that you really do get a discount using the promo code Hartman. Just go to mypillow.com and click on the radio and podcast square and enter the promo code, or you can call 1-800-566-6745. That's 1-800-566-6745 and use the promo code Hartman to get deep discounts on all MyPillow products. Well, I learned about him through Machiavelli's writings, and it's true that he was a fascinating figure. And you know, you learn a lot about history through Machiavelli's writings. You said earlier that he read a lot of Livy, who was the Roman historian. Machiavelli wrote a subsequent book, Discourses on Livy. And it really is cool how much The Prince is replete with stories about the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic. And so if Machiavelli couldn't learn some things through his own dealings, as you were outlining in his own life, he learned from the mistakes and the triumphs also of other people. That's what I think, that was true of Balthazar Gracian. He had a really rich understanding of history. That's something that a lot of people lack today, great writers lack. So I want to go and talk about some of Machiavelli's most famous assertions. And I love this question, as you know, and the viewers know. I've said it now 3 times. Does he deserve the charge of ruthless or Machiavellian? Now, you highlighted a line where Machiavelli said, fortune is like a woman. And if I remember the line correctly, he said that needs to be, beaten into submission. There were some lines like that were just plainly ruthless and made him seem awful. But not to give him a pass, we also have to remember that he was a 16th century Florentine guy. It was just a different time that he was writing some of these things. But let me zero in on one of these assertions that he makes, which I think is kind of the basis of his term of the term Machiavellian. He talks about the need for refoundings, how a republic the people have to be reminded of the force of the state and why the republic exists. And Machiavelli advocates for public executions, which he says are good because they both, quote, satisfy and stupefy the population. What is just as someone who knows a lot about Machiavelli, studies him, what is your assessment of that claim? Do you think that was excessively ruthless, or do you think he might have a point?
Well, Actually, this, I think, is one of the least controversial of Machiavelli's statements. You were absolutely right in your last comments in placing Machiavelli in his context. And public executions do play a very, very important role, both in the functioning of Renaissance polities and in the evolution of ideas of reason and state. Let me give an example from the very beginning of Machiavelli's political career. In 1499, Florence is trying to recover the port town of Pisa, which it's lost a few years before. Pisa is really important to the Florentine economy. It's their window to the world, if you like. And so, in order to try and reconquer the town, they, not having a standing army or militia at this stage, it will later thanks to Machiavelli, they hire a lot of mercenaries. And they place their mercenary army under the command of a man called Paolo Vitelli. And the Vitelli are a well-established family of condottieri, of mercenary generals. A day comes, however, when Paolo Vitelli has an advantage. He punches a hole in the walls of Pisa and can take the city. But he doesn't. For some reason, he stops. He doesn't do anything. The Florentines are amazed. They have him arrested because they have a big debate about what to do with him. Many people think he only stopped because he was a traitor, because like many other mercenary generals of the period, he'd taken a bribe from somebody not to do the thing that was asked of him. Others said, no, he doesn't have to be a traitor. He could easily just be incompetent. He could be a fool. And the debate goes round and round in circles. There's no proof either way. And eventually the decision is taken to execute him anyway. Why? Not because they necessarily think he is either a traitor, definitely, or definitely a fool, but rather pour encourager les autres. To put off any other mercenary general who might be tempted either to indulge his incompetent side or worse, to be a traitor. And the argument that's made is one that will be articulated especially clearly and well by Machiavelli in many of his works. That is the idea of the reason of state. That while as private individuals we might be bound by the norms of Christian virtue, where killing is a great sin, the state is not bound by those same norms. Indeed, there are times, as Machiavelli will later write, when in order to preserve its liberty, the republic must do things which rebel against all forms of Christian virtue. This was not unique to Florence. If any of your viewers know Venice well, they will perhaps have visited the Piazzetta as you approach St. Mark's Square from the Grand Canal. And in that square, there are two columns between the corner of the Doge's Palace and the Marciana. It looks great, makes for smashing photos today, but it was between those two pillars that traitors were executed. And that site was chosen very deliberately to be extremely visible and to prove to others that you couldn't get away with any crimes against the state. So I do think this particular statement of Machiavelli's is actually, as I said at the beginning, not too controversial for the time, but actually reflective of an emergent strand of thought which will be brought out with particular clarity in his writings.
I'd like to follow up with what you just said about the undermining is the wrong word, but how Machiavelli doesn't pay close attention in some ways to Christian virtues. That's something that Strauss said. He said that Machiavelli's was the first work of its time which, quote, divorces political morality from Christian ethics. Machiavelli says he cares more about the effectual truth of the thing than the imagination of it. That's from the introduction of The Prince. And I that's one of the things I admire most about Machiavelli. He doesn't wax eloquent about how things in an imaginary utopian state ought to be. Not that that sometimes isn't valuable, but he looks at the way things really are, the effectual truth of things, and tries to behave accordingly. I would like to respectfully disagree with Strauss, though. I actually am not so convinced that Machiavelli divorces political morality from Christian ethics, because in each of his justifications for certain actions, I actually think he goes back to a virtue that he is trying to uphold. And I think one of Machiavelli's greatest contributions is something that we, especially in the United States, ought to understand today, is that sometimes a virtue taken to an extreme undermines the very virtue that you are trying to bring into effect. The most famous example that Machiavelli cites, and again, I bring up American society, we really need to learn this, is the balancing of generosity and what Machiavelli calls cruelty. And he says that it's a good thing to have mercy. It's a good thing to be generous, but, quote, he should take care to not use his mercy badly. And he talks about how the Florentine people were once treated with such generosity, such mercy, so because the leader didn't want to be seen as cruel, that the town just ran wild with crime and all of these bad effects. So I think what Machiavelli tries to do in a situation is not just be ruthless or be contrarian for the sake of it, but he goes, hey, if we want to be generous, sometimes we have to do the opposite in order to bring about the most generosity. And I think that is, going back to at its core, a Christian virtue.
Well, I think maybe I can strike a middle ground here, strike a compromise, a position between you and Strauss, maybe. You're right to emphasize the idea of effectual truth. This is the key, the linchpin, if you like, of Machiavelli's whole approach to politics. And it is what marks him out as very different from anyone who's gone before. It's a funny term. It's not one that he uses at any other point in his writings, and isn't actually one that's terribly common in Italian either. It appears to derive its meaning from Aristotle, or at least some interpretations of Aristotle anyway. And the contrast he seems to be drawing is between, lies in the realm of causes, specifically the contrast between final causes and effectual causes, or effective causes. Final causes are those which point towards the end for which something is intended, whereas effective causes really looks at the way things change, if you like. That's really simplifying it very much. But the reason I put it that way is deliberate, because this is really the contrast Machiavelli is trying to draw to emphasize what he's doing. Previous writers had always looked at final causes, final truths, if you like. That's to say, they had approached politics from the point of view of salvation, the point of view of the principles, the virtues, the Christian virtues that we should embody in order to merit salvation and guide humanity towards its potentiality. And the problem with that, he said, was that it really didn't have anything to do with the world we live in. It wasn't very flexible. It didn't allow you to adapt to the changes in fortune, coming back to a point we were talking about earlier. It constrained your actions, and quite often, in many of its manifestations, left you vulnerable to great difficulties. It left you worse off. If you tried to be too kind when your opponents are pretty wicked, then obviously you're going to come off worse. So he is interested in looking at how things change. And in looking at politics as a changing, evolving reality, he comes to believe that the most important thing is not Christian virtue, but virtu, that is to say, a quality of manliness. And that entails being bold, being audacious, and being daring. And yes, it does also involve a willingness, and I really want to emphasize that word, willingness, to diverge from those norms which are common to Christian thought, namely mercy, generosity, honesty, if the circumstances require, and a willingness to be, by contrast, parsimonious, cruel, and dishonest where necessary. Now, this is a big break from the past. But does that mean that Machiavelli is anti-Christian? No. on its own, this isn't necessarily the case, though many later writers, particularly during the Wars of Religion, did pick up on this particular point as a way of saying, this is a pretty irreligious, amoral person. He's not saying that a ruler should always be cruel, parsimonious, and dishonest. He's simply saying, they should be ready to do it when appropriate. If they can be honest, if they can be, generous to a point, if they can be kind and merciful, great. But they shouldn't be constrained by it, and they should always appear, at the very least, to be decent Christian people. As far as organised religion goes, it's rather different. Machiavelli is exceptionally critical of the contemporary church for two major reasons. One, because the church at the time was not just the Catholic Church was not just a spiritual power, but wielded great temporal power. It held large tracts of land in central Italy, and its constant meddling in the politics of the peninsula, to a certain extent, jeopardized its authority as a religious power. The second reason he's pretty opposed to it is he thinks, slightly anticipating Nietzsche to a certain extent, that it's a bit kind of wheedly and wet. It doesn't inspire people with a fiery virtue that is needed to defend the liberty of their republic, no matter what. What he does think religion has a vitally important role to play, and religious morality has a vitally important role to play in protecting the liberty of a state, but it must be a religion that is vigorous, he says, a religion that is able to motivate people to go out and, if necessary, butcher people in the defense of their liberty. The kind of religious rights that he's looking for are those that were found in the early years of Roman history under the kings. So, to return to your question more directly, I think he does break with the past, but he's not completely anti-religious at all. And in actual fact, he is effectively erecting a new morality.
Yes, I think you've highlighted a crucial distinction about virtue, whereas Christian virtue comes from exercising the virtue because it is good and it is the right thing to do. For Machiavelli, it is more about the effect, about exercising while somewhat subverting the virtue in order to bring out the best possible outcome. But I do want to highlight for the audience, because I care very much about this myth that I believe has been conjured up about Machiavelli. Maybe this, like all myths, there's a grain of truth in there, but I think he is too strongly smeared. He, in that famous "it's better to be feared than loved," people don't read the beginning part of that statement. He doesn't just say it's better to be feared than loved, period. He says one would want to be both loved and feared, but because it is difficult to put them together, it is safer to be feared than loved if one had to choose. So it shows here that Machiavelli doesn't just toss out virtue. He's not just, in my judgment, ruthless for the sake of it, but certainly, to your point, right, Dr. Lee, he does care about the effectual truth of things. I would also, because you brought up Nietzsche, and before we have to part, I want to highlight something that I found to be really interesting when I was reading The Prince. The Prince was published in 1517. That year is significant for another reason. It was the year that Martin Luther pinned the 95 Theses to the door of the castle church. So we see in that same year, these two figures are deeply critical of the medieval Catholic Church, which was truly totalitarian, ideologically and also politically. And it's just one of those historical coincidences that these two prolific thinkers of Western civilization that kind of changed the course of religion, they published their works in the same year, just a few hundred miles apart.
Absolutely right. No, I mean, to a certain extent, you touched on an important point. In fairness, The Prince is actually written probably about 4 years before that, and it doesn't appear in print until after his death in 1527.
That's true.
But I think it is presented to its dedicatee at about the time you mentioned. I'd have to check the exact date. It escapes my memory for the moment. But you're absolutely right. They both inhabit a world where attitudes towards organized religion are very much in flux. But what's very interesting is the fact that Machiavelli himself says almost nothing about Luther. In fact, I looked for this the other day by a great coincidence, and I think I found only one reference to Luther, Lutheranism, or Lutherans in the entire of his corpus. And this is unusual because, of course, Lutheranism does shake up the whole of Europe in a dramatic way, and much of Machiavelli's own political life from 1570 onwards is influenced by the Reformation in Germany, principally through its impact on the dynamics of the Holy Roman Empire, and the involvement of Lutheran landsknechts or mercenaries in a subsequent military invasion of Italy and the sack of Rome. But he is strangely silent about Lutheranism. And part of that may be simply because of its limited penetration in Italy at that point. But to my mind, that's the really fascinating puzzle of it all, really. How these two figures, each of whom to a certain extent is grappling with the same context, religious context, if I can put it that way, but yet they seem to kind of pass like ships in the night.
Yes. Well, this has been very enlightening about Machiavelli, and I encourage everyone to check out Dr. Lee's book, Machiavelli, His Life and Times, and especially go to the end of the book and look at the pictures, the paintings that Dr. Lee includes. I think they enhance the contents of the book very much. And what beautiful art there was back in Machiavelli's time.
Quite right.
And in the era that you specialize in, the Renaissance. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me, Julie.
And thank you all so much for joining me. I'll see you soon. Take care.